The 25th of December, 1991. A cold Moscow night. The red flag above the Kremlin lowers slowly, its edges catching the winter. Wind like the last breath of a dying colossus. To the world, it looked like the end of an ideology. A battle between communism and capitalism finally concluded political defeat, symbolic collapse. But beneath the televised spectacle, another story was unfolding, a quieter one, a fatal one, because the Soviet Union didn't truly fall on that winter night. It died months earlier, inside ledger books no camera ever filmed. It died in unpaid invoices for imported wheat. It died in vaults where gold reserves had quietly drained away. It died in ministries where officials stared at empty accounts and realized the truth. A nuclear superpower had gone bankrupt. This was not the collapse of a government. It was the insolvency of an empire. On paper, the USSR still commanded 40,000 nuclear warheads. It had millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a space program that once stunned the world. But none of that mattered when the treasury could no longer afford bread. The contradiction was staggering. It looked like a titan, but inside it was hollow, a superpower built on subsidies, inefficient factories, and a single commodity that hid the cracks for decades. Oil-black gold had been the USSR's oxygen tank, and for years Moscow mistook the mask for the lungs. The Soviet Union confused a temporary boom for eternal prosperity, and the bill for that illusion would come due with a vengeance. By the time the flag lowered, the collapse was already irreversible. The bankruptcy had begun long before the world noticed, and the story doesn't start with protests or coups, but in the late 1960s, deep inside the frozen oil fields of western Siberia, where the seeds of both salvation and destruction were planted, the world saw an empire fall, but history saw a balance sheet collapse. This is how a nation that conquered Berlin and reached the moon was ultimately defeated. By arithmetic, we go back to where it believed its fortune began. Siberia, 1965. In the frozen wastelands near the Obi River, Soviet geologists drilled into the earth and struck what looked like a miracle. Samoutlor, one of the largest oil fields ever discovered, a vast, shimmering ocean of crude buried beneath permafrost. For a stagnating planned economy, it felt like a divine rescue. Factories weren't producing competitive goods. Agriculture was failing. Consumer shelves were bare. But suddenly, none of that mattered. Why build better cars when you can sell oil? Why reform a broken agricultural system when every barrel brings in hard Western currency? Black gold rewrote the Soviet dream. And slowly, quietly, fatally, it replaced the Soviet strategy. Throughout the 1970s, global oil prices exploded. The OPEC embargo sent shockwaves through the Western world, but in Moscow it triggered jubilation. Billions of dollars poured into the Soviet treasury. Money flowed faster than the leadership knew how to manage. Hard currency reserves ballooned. Subsidies expanded. Military budgets soared. It was a golden age built on quicksand, because the oil boom didn't fix the Soviet economy. It concealed it. Agriculture continued to rot. Factories producing tractors, radios, and machine tools fell decades behind Western quality. Innovation collapsed under the weight of bureaucracy, but the oil money kept everyone silent. It bought social peace. It bought political loyalty. It bought the illusion of eternal strength. The USSR was transforming into something dangerous, a petro-state with rockets. A military colossus balanced on a single volatile commodity. And like any addiction, it came with a hidden cost. The entire Soviet budget became dependent on one number, the global price of oil. As long as oil stayed above $30 a barrel, the system looked invincible. But beneath the surface, another story was already brewing. Falling efficiency, rising imports, and a population increasingly dependent on cheap, subsidized essentials. The Soviet economy was no longer a diversified engine. It was a one-cylinder machine running at full speed, overheating, shaking, and burning itself from within. The leadership celebrated the oil wealth as a triumph of socialism, but the truth was darker. They had built a world power not on production, but on extraction, not on strength, but on luck. And luck never lasts forever. The perfect economic storm, the 1980s, arrived like a cold wind. For decades, The USSR believed the oil river would flow endlessly. But global markets were shifting, efficiency in the West improved. New oil fields in the North Sea and Alaska increased supply. Energy demand weakened. Oil prices began to wobble. And that wobble was the first tremor before the earthquake. At the same time, another crisis surged inside the USSR, one far more humiliating. A nation with some of the richest farmland on earth could not feed itself. Collective farms rotted under inefficiency. Half the harvest spoiled before reaching stores. Millions of tons of grain had to be imported annually. And who supplied the grain? The Soviet Union's greatest rival, the United States. The USSR sold oil to buy food from the very country it vowed to surpass. By the early 1980s, nearly half of all Soviet hard currency earnings were spent just to keep citizens from starving. Every barrel of oil was essentially traded for a loaf of bread. But what came next changed everything. In 1985, Saudi Arabia made a historic decision. Tired of propping up high prices, they opened their wells fully. Oil flooded the global market. Prices collapsed overnight. In 1980, oil was over $35 a barrel. By 1986, it hit $10. And at that moment, the Soviet Union lost half its income. The impact was instant and catastrophic. Imagine losing half your salary overnight. But your rent, bills, and debts remain exactly the same. That was the Soviet budget in 1986. The Empire's vast military machine still needed fuel. Its satellite states in Eastern Europe still demanded subsidies. The war in Afghanistan still consumed millions daily. The aging industrial sector still required imports of Western machinery to keep its rusting gears turning. But the treasury, it was suddenly a crater. Inside the Kremlin, panic began to take shape, not openly. Soviet politics didn't allow panic to show, but behind closed doors, ministers stared at collapsing revenue charts with silent dread. And into this storm walked a man who believed he could save the system, Mikhail Gorbachev. Young, charismatic, determined to breathe life into a stagnant superpower, he launched perestroika, promising restructuring, modernization, a new era of dynamism. But Gorbachev didn't realize the truth. His ambitious reforms required money, enormous amounts of it. And the money was no longer there. The foundation of the Soviet state had been an oil-fueled illusion. Without that money, every weakness the system had buried for decades began rising to the surface. Factories that once seemed busy now revealed themselves as obsolete. Collective farms that always underperformed now became outright catastrophes. Bread lines lengthened. Consumers hoarded essentials. Shops emptied faster than they could be restocked. And yet, the worst was still coming, because while domestic problems mounted, the USSR faced a second blow from the global market. As oil prices crashed, Soviet agriculture delivered one of its worst harvests in years. Grain imports surged again, millions of tons of food that required payment in dollars, not rubles. Dollars the USSR no longer had. The empire had walked straight into a perfect economic storm. Falling revenue, exploding expenses, collapsing productivity, rising dependence on foreign food, and no flexibility inside a centrally planned economy to adapt or pivot. For the first time since World War II, Soviet officials quietly admitted among themselves the country was running out of money. By 1986, the crisis was undeniable. The oil crash wasn't a temporary setback. It was a structural collapse, the end of a financial illusion that had propped up a dying system. The Soviet Union had bet everything on a single commodity. When that commodity fell, the entire empire began to sink with it. And yet, instead of stabilizing, the Soviet leadership made a choice that would push the economy from crisis into freefall, a choice born of desperation, a choice that would trap the USSR in a deadly spiral of debt, deficits, and eventual implosion. When the oil money vanished, the Soviet leadership faced a brutal truth: the empire could no longer afford itself. But instead of cutting expenses, restructuring the economy, or admitting insolvency, the Kremlin chose a different path. One that every collapsing empire eventually takes. They began borrowing. At first, it looked harmless. Western banks in Paris, London, and Frankfurt were eager to lend to the Soviet Union. This was a nuclear superpower, after all. A country that had never defaulted. A country whose size alone made it appear too big to fail. Loans were extended not out of confidence, but out of assumption. Banks assumed the USSR couldn't go broke. But the money flowing into Moscow wasn't investment capital. It wasn't being used to modernize industry or build profitable exports. It wasn't used for growth at all. It was survival money. Billions were borrowed just to keep grocery shelves from going completely empty. Billions more were spent buying foreign consumer goods to prevent public anger. The empire was taking on debt not to build the future, but to postpone the present, and beneath the surface, another disaster was unfolding. Gorbachev made a moral decision that turned into a fiscal catastrophe. He declared war on alcohol. Vodka, the greatest tax engine of the Soviet state, had funded schools, roads, factories, even the military. When Gorbachev restricted its sale, he believed he was saving the Soviet worker. Instead, he destroyed one of the government's largest revenue streams overnight. But the people didn't stop drinking. They simply made their own. Moonshine production exploded. Sugar disappeared from stores because families bought it in bulk to ferment into liquor. The state lost revenue. The population lost health. And the economy lost stability. As budget deficits grew, the Kremlin made the fatal choice that all failing economies eventually make. They turned on the printing presses. Rubles poured into circulation, but because Soviet shelves were empty, money had nothing to buy. People accumulated cash that had no meaning. This was the birth of the monetary overhang, a silent, invisible monster building year after year. And then the shortages hit. In cities across the USSR, citizens stood in line for hours for basics like bread, butter, and shoes. If people saw a line, they joined it without asking what it was for. They knew that if anything was available today, it might vanish tomorrow. Barter replaced money. Factories paid workers in whatever they produced, tires, nails, furniture, because rubles were worthless. And outside the Soviet borders, the world was watching. Western banks began to panic. They realized the USSR wasn't borrowing to grow. It was borrowing to survive, and soon they would be borrowing to repay debt itself. Inside Eastern Europe, satellite states sensed the weakness. They began breaking away economically, refusing to trade under Soviet terms, demanding payment in hard currency. The ruble trade zone shattered. The empire's financial walls were collapsing from both the center and the edges. The USSR was entering its final phase, a stage where the government could no longer fund itself, its people, or its institutions. But the worst was still ahead. Because the next blow wouldn't come from outside enemies, it would come from within the empire itself. By the late 1980s, the Soviet crisis was no longer just economic. It was political. It was institutional. It was existential. The empire wasn't collapsing from pressure at the borders. It was collapsing from the inside, from the very republics that formed its backbone. The moment the money began to run out, the unity of the Soviet Union began to fracture. It started quietly. Regional leaders noticed that Moscow could no longer fund basic services. Factories lacked supplies. Hospitals lacked medicine. Wages arrived late, if they arrived at all. So the republics made a decision that would shatter the spine of the USSR. They stopped sending money to the center. This rebellion was called the War of Laws. Moscow passed a law. Republics passed their own law to override it. And crucially, they kept their tax revenues instead of forwarding them to the federal budget. The empire wasn't just starving financially. It was being choked by its own children. At the front of this rebellion was Boris Yeltsin, the rising leader of the Russian Republic. He declared that Russian laws were superior to Soviet laws. He encouraged tax collectors to keep funds inside Russia. Suddenly, the Kremlin, the symbolic heart of a nuclear superpower, had no income. Gorbachev was president of a country that existed on paper but not in cash. And then another pillar collapsed. The gold. For decades, Soviet gold reserves had been a mythic symbol of strength, rumored to be thousands of tons. But now, in desperation, the government quietly shipped gold abroad to sell at whatever price they could get. The world noticed. South African traders, London refiners, Swiss bankers, all began whispering the same thing. Moscow is dumping gold. Panic selling pushed prices down, meaning the Soviets got even less for every ton they sold. The vaults, once a source of pride, became echo chambers. And while the state sold off its gold, its people were losing faith in money entirely. Inflation surged. Savings evaporated. Store shelves emptied. Hyperinflation teased the horizon like a coming storm. Workers waited months for wages. Some soldiers weren't paid at all. Factories shut down lines because they lacked spare parts or electricity. And then came a humiliation that no superpower had ever faced. Cargo ships carrying food began refusing to dock. Captains radioed, payment first. Then we unload. Some sat for days, some turned back home. A nuclear empire begging for wheat. Inside Moscow's financial institutions, panic became policy. Neshekonombank, the bank responsible for foreign economic dealings, froze all hard currency accounts. Companies that earned dollars through exports woke up to find their accounts empty. Their money had been seized to keep the state barely breathing. Trust evaporated overnight. The economy descended further into barter. Money became a rumor. And then came the final explosion of instability. August 1991. A group of hardliners attempted a coup to save the collapsing system. Tanks rolled into Moscow. A last attempt to restore the old order. But a coup cannot overthrow truth. You cannot arrest insolvency. You cannot imprison arithmetic. The coup failed, not because of powerful resistance, but because the Soviet state was already financially dead. Gorbachev returned to power, but the system had already slipped beyond saving. The republics were gone in spirit, and soon they would be gone in law. The Soviet collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. And the answer would come on a cold December day, when a superpower officially declared bankruptcy. Legacy and Final Reckoning, December 1991. A date carved into the memory of the 20th century. The Kremlin stood silent beneath a pale winter sky as the red flag, the banner of a superpower, was lowered for the last time. To millions watching around the world, it appeared to be a political ending, a clash of ideologies, a moment of liberation for some and despair for others. But beneath the symbolism, beneath the speeches and the television cameras, the truth was brutally simple. The Soviet Union died because it went broke. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, not because he was defeated by an invading army. He resigned because the government he led no longer had the money to function. By the end of 1991, the USSR had no gold, no grain, no hard currency, no functioning budget, no loyal tax base, no path back to solvency. It was not a collapse of ideology, it was a collapse of liquidity. And when the empire dissolved, someone had to inherit the wreckage. That someone was the Russian Federation. Russia inherited the nuclear arsenal. Russia inherited the embassies, and Russia inherited the debt, every dollar of it. The West demanded a signatory, a guarantor for the billions owed. Boris Yeltsin agreed. In exchange for claiming the Soviet Union's foreign assets, Russia accepted full responsibility for the Soviet Union's liabilities. It was called the zero option. But for Russia, it was anything but zero. The new Russian state entered life already suffocating under a mountain of inherited debt. There was no money for a gentle transition to a market economy. No savings to cushion the shock, no budget to support industries, pensions, or families. So price controls were lifted overnight, subsidies vanished. Shops that had once sold bread for kopecks now sold it for prices that rose daily. Hyperinflation arrived like a tidal wave. Savings evaporated. Millions who had worked their entire lives discovered that everything they had put aside was now worth nothing. Factories collapsed. Regions starved. A black market became the only market. The 1990s for ordinary Russians were not a decade of freedom. They were a decade of survival. And yet the shadow of Soviet insolvency stretched even further. In 1998, Russia defaulted again, crushed under the weight of old obligations and new crises. Markets around the world trembled. Once more, the financial ghost of the USSR rose from its grave. It would take 26 years until 2017 for the last remnants of Soviet debt to be fully repaid. A final transfer, made quietly to Bosnia and Herzegovina, closed the books on the world's greatest national bankruptcy. Decades after the red flag fell, the ledger remained open. The empire had dissolved politically in 1991, but economically, its aftershocks continued for a generation. And the lesson they leave behind is stark. A superpower can survive pressure from enemies. It can survive ideological battles. It can survive political stagnation and military overreach. But it cannot survive insolvency. When a nation becomes dependent on a single commodity, when it treats temporary fortune as permanent wealth, when it masks structural decline with borrowed money, when its people lose faith in their own currency, the collapse becomes inevitable. The Soviet Union did not fall. It was liquidated, written down like an insolvent corporation whose debts outlived its purpose. Its true epitaph is simple: a superpower armed with nuclear warheads, but unable to buy bread. The hammer and sickle did not shatter. It went bankrupt. Subscribe to Cinematic Empire Chronicles to stay ahead of the stories shaping our world. Because history's greatest collapses are never just about the past. They're warnings.